Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more intense, mysterious stories full of twists and turns. And now I want to know from you, where are you watching this story from? Leave a comment with the name of your city and country. I love to know how far our stories are traveling. In 1884, in the city of San Jose, California, a grieving woman stepped out of a carriage before an old, abandoned farmhouse. The dry west wind stirred the black veil over her pale face. Her name was Sarah Winchester, heiress to the fortune of one of the largest arms industries in the United States. To the public, she was merely an eccentric widow seeking seclusion away from the pressures of high society. To a few, however, she carried something heavier than her fortune, an invisible fear that haunted her day and night. The farm seemed insignificant. Aged wood, crooked fences, the smell of dust and solitude. Even so, Sarah bought it without haggling over the price. That same day, she hired laborers, architects and carpenters. She ordered them never to interrupt their work. Never, not day, not night. No one understood the reason, but the money spoke louder than questions. As the months went by, the small farm began to grow in a strange way. A corridor led to a door that opened onto a wall. Stairs climbed to the ceiling. Windows were installed in the floor. Rooms were built and then quickly demolished. Architectural plans were never shown to the workers. Every instruction came directly from Sarah, handwritten on small notes that changed daily. As the house became an impossible labyrinth, Sarah remained isolated in her quarters. She was almost never seen during the day. At night, however, the servants swore they heard light footsteps in the newly built corridors, doors opening on their own, and the distant sound of a bell echoing through the structure. But this is not a ghost story told to scare tourists. This is a true story, documented, recorded, witnessed by dozens of people, about a woman who believed she was building something bigger than a house, something necessary to survive. The antagonist in this story was not a man. It was not a visible entity. It was inherited guilt, silent and persistent, born from the blood spilled by Winchester weapons during decades of wars, conflicts and crimes. Each rifle produced had taken a life, and Sarah believed that each life taken now demanded its due. The conflict began even before the first plank was laid. After the death of her husband and only son, Sarah plunged into a despair that no doctor could cure. Insomnia, anxiety attacks, a constant feeling of being watched. In Boston, where she lived, she said she heard voices whispering her name in the middle of the night. Friends suggested rest. Doctors recommended medication. Nothing worked. It was then that an unusual consultation changed her destiny. A spiritualist medium. He claimed that the spirits of the victims of the Winchester weapons demanded a price. He said that Sarah should build a house for them, a place where they could live. If she stopped building, she would die. Sarah didn't answer. She simply got up, left the room and, days later, departed for the West. Upon arriving in California, she began construction without ever explaining her motivation to the workers. Some said she talked to herself in empty rooms. Others claimed to see her holding invisible blueprints in mid-air, as if consulting non-existent architects. Over time, the house became an urban anomaly. Newspapers began publishing curious notes about the eccentric widow who builds non-stop. Neighbors observed with bewilderment the constant sound of hammers late into the night. Local children invented stories about monsters trapped in the hallways. Still, no one dared to enter without an invitation. One winter night, one of the carpenters, tired, decided to explore a newly finished hallway. He followed a sequence of identical doors. He opened the first, empty. The second, empty. The third, a furnished room lit by a single candle. Sarah was there, kneeling in the center, murmuring inaudible words. He closed the door slowly and never told what he saw. He resigned the next morning. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her daily ritual. sketching new changes, destroying existing structures, adding secret passages and staircases that led nowhere. It was as if she were following a map that only she could see. But something even more unsettling grew along with the house, Sarah's own silence. She spoke less and less, slept almost not at all, and spent long periods locked in a room known only as the Blue Room. No one knew what happened inside. Only the faint ringing of a bell could be heard, always at 2 in the morning. The mystery deepened. Sarah was protecting herself from something real. Or was she being guided by something that no one else could perceive? The construction would continue for decades, without pauses, without answers, without explanations. And the real reason was still hidden, waiting for the moment to reveal itself. The city of St. Joseph, at the end of the 19th century, it was not yet the technological hub the world would come to know. It was a small agricultural community, surrounded by orchards of plums, apricots, and walnut trees. The sweet scent of ripe fruit mingled with the dust of dirt roads and the distant sound of horseshoes. In this peaceful setting, Sarah Winchester's growing mansion emerged as a constantly mutating wooden scar, alive, restless, impossible to ignore. Local residents learned to live with the incessant noise of the construction. Some complained. Others took advantage of the work opportunity. For many, the house was an economic blessing. For others, a bad omen. Among the workers, the following stood out. Elias Carter Elias, a meticulous carpenter from Sacramento. Unlike the others, Elias wasn't content to simply obey orders. He observed. He mentally noted every change, every strange decision, every detail out of place. He perceived patterns where others saw madness. Elias was the first to notice that Sarah never repeated an order. No plant was used twice, no staircase followed a conventional pattern, and, curiously, certain structures were built only to be destroyed days later, always after Sarah spent an entire night in the Blue Room. The housekeeper, Margaret O'Neill Margaret, an Irish woman with a firm voice and attentive gaze, was the only person who had direct access to Sarah's quarters. Margaret took care of the meals, the cleaning, and the mail. Although almost no letters were sent or received, she saw her mistress only once a day, when she left the dinner tray before the closed door. Sometimes I would find the food untouched the following morning. Margaret also noticed something peculiar. Every night at exactly 2 in the morning, a small bell would ring through the house. Soon after, soft sounds of footsteps would echo through the hallways, but they never coincided with the human footsteps of the night watchman. In the village, rumors grew. The local priest said Sarah needed prayer. Doctors called her a victim of chronic melancholy. Children said the house swallowed people, but no one dared confront her. Her money funded schools, markets, and even repairs to the church. Meanwhile, Sarah followed a rigid routine. Every morning before sunrise, she wrote detailed instructions for the foreman. She never spoke to them personally. The notes were delivered by Margaret. At the end of the day, Sarah walked slowly through the corridors, touching the walls as if checking her pulse. Sometimes she stopped in front of a door, murmured something, and continued on her way. One afternoon, Elias found a note left on a table. Unlike the others, it wasn't a construction order. It was a single sentence. If they find the right room, it's all over. He kept the sentence to himself. An invisible antagonism was taking shape in the minds of the workers. Some began to believe that Sarah wasn't the owner of the house. She was merely the caretaker. Others believed that something controlled her. No one dared to ask directly. For Sarah, however, the outside world was becoming less and less real. Her true universe lay within those walls that never stopped moving. She believed that each hammer blow confused the spirits that haunted her. Every dead-end corridor was a trap. Every incomplete staircase was a distraction for forces seeking to reach her. But even Sarah wasn't sure if she was still in control. Some nights, she would wake up in different rooms with no memory of how she got there. Other times, she would find new doors that she didn't remember ordering. The house was no longer just a refuge. It was an organism growing on its own. And at the center of it all, Sarah Winchester was trying to survive a threat that only she seemed to see. The year was 1891 when construction reached a critical point. The mansion already had dozens of corridors, staircases that ended nowhere, and rooms that were never used. Even so, Sarah ordered the work to be accelerated. New workers were hired, teams began working in uninterrupted shifts, and wood arrived in carts without ceasing. But the bigger the house grew, the more unstable Sarah became. Margaret noticed first. Her employer began talking in her sleep, disconnected phrases, unfamiliar names, pleas for forgiveness. Some nights, Margaret discreetly opened the bedroom door and found Sarah sitting on the bed, eyes open, staring into space. "They are closer," she murmured once, not realizing that the housekeeper was watching her. The next day, Sarah ordered the construction of a spiral staircase that ended at the ceiling with no exit. Then she had a secret tunnel dug behind a wardrobe. Shortly after, she demanded that an entire room be dismantled. The workers began to question things. Not openly, but in whispers, Elias Carter became the point of reference among them. He gathered accounts, tools that disappeared and reappeared in other rooms, locked doors that opened by themselves, drafts of cold air in closed corridors, until something changed. One night, a young laborer named Thomas decided to stay after his shift to finish a wall. The sound of hammers ceased, the lanterns were extinguished, and silence filled the house. Hours later, Thomas did not return to the village. At dawn, a search began. Margaret found the young man sitting on a step of a staircase that led nowhere. He was alive but in shock. His eyes were fixed, his hands trembling. Elijah approached. "What happened?" he asked. Thomas opened his mouth, but his voice came out as a hoarse whisper. The house moved. He said he heard the bell ring at 2 a.m. Soon after, footsteps echoed through the corridors. Doors slammed, and then walls creaked as if breathing. He ran, but each door he opened led to a different place than he remembered, until he found the dead-end staircase, and there he stood, paralyzed until dawn. The news spread quickly. Some workers quit their jobs. Others demanded a raise. Sarah, upon learning what had happened, showed no surprise. She simply wrote new instructions. More corridors, more doors, more stairs. And then came the earthquake. In the early morning hours of 1906, the ground in California trembled violently. Houses collapsed, streets split open, and people screamed in the streets of San Jose. When the dust settled, part of the mansion had crumbled. Entire towers gave way, rooms were buried, staircases disappeared under the rubble. The workers rushed to rescue Sarah. They found her trapped in an inner room, covered in dust, but alive. When they pulled her out, she didn't ask about injuries or damage. I simply said, "They finally found their way." After the earthquake, something changed definitively. Sarah isolated herself almost completely. She spent entire days in the blue room. The nightly bell continued, but now additional sounds emerged after it. Collective whispers, like a crowd talking all at once. Margaret tried to convince her employer to leave the house, even if only temporarily. Sarah refused. "If I go out, they go out with me," he responded. Meanwhile, Elias decided to investigate on his own. On a quiet night, he followed the sound of the bell. He walked through corridors he knew, but which seemed narrower. He passed through doors he didn't remember existing, until he reached a small room hidden behind a false wall. In the center of the room was a chair. On it, a single antique Winchester rifle. And on the walls, dozens of names were handwritten, some blurred by time, others recent. Elias read one of the names aloud. As he did so, he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. The door closed by itself behind him. When Margaret found Elias the next morning, he was sitting on the floor, pale, unable to speak. After that day, he never returned to the construction site. The conflict was no longer merely psychological. The house had crossed the line of rationality. Workers saw shadowy figures, visitors felt invisible hands touching their shoulders, and Sarah seemed increasingly convinced that time was running out. She wrote her last great order. The house should never be finished, and because if construction stopped, the reckoning would begin. Over the years, the mansion ceased to be merely an impossible architectural project and became its own ecosystem. New workers arrived without knowing the complete history. Former employees left in silence, taking with them secrets they would never share. Within that ever-changing structure, small parallel stories unfolded, all orbiting the same center, Sarah Winchester and her relentless fear. Margaret O'Neill, the housekeeper, became the only bridge between Sarah and the real world. She managed the supplies, paid the workers, and answered the few letters that arrived. Silently, she assumed the role of protector of the house, not out of belief in spirits, but out of loyalty to the woman who, despite everything, gave her purpose. But Margaret also had her limits. The constant isolation was beginning to affect her. Some nights, she swore she heard her deceased mother calling her name in the hallways. Other times, when lighting a candle, she noticed that there were already other candles lit, even though she was sure no one had passed by. Margaret's subplot grew. She had to decide whether to continue serving Sarah or flee that house that seemed to be slowly draining her sanity. Meanwhile, in the village, the journalist Henry Collins. He began investigating the history of the endless house. He published sensationalist articles suggesting that Sarah was hiding crimes or performing occult rituals. His writings attracted curious onlookers to the city. Some tried to peek through the gates, others offered money to visit the mansion. Sarah never allowed entry. Henry wasn't satisfied. He decided to sneak in. On a moonless night, he climbed the side wall and entered one of the inner gardens. He walked between windows lit from within, even though he knew everyone must be asleep. He found an unlocked door and went inside. Hours later, he ran out, pale, repeating to himself, "It's not a house, it's a trap." The next day, Henry left town. He never wrote another line about the case. Another subplot emerged among the workers. The belief that some rooms were safe and others were not. They created secret maps, marking corridors that should never be used after the bell rang. Some carried amulets, others prayed before starting their shift. The work continued, but now under an invisible tension. There was also Jacob, the night watchman. A quiet man, a war veteran, accustomed to strange sounds. He swore that at 2 a.m. he saw shadows passing through walls. A certain female figure walked slowly through the corridors. It wasn't Sarah, for she wore clothes from another era. Jacob began to follow her silently, night after night, until one early morning the figure entered a door and disappeared. Jacob opened the door soon after and found only a solid wall. The next day, he resigned without explaining why. These parallel stories didn't detract from the main focus. On the contrary, they reinforced the atmosphere of inevitability. Everyone who touched the house was affected. Everyone who tried to understand it gave up. The mansion seemed to protect its secret with human and structural layers. But time was pressing Sarah. She no longer walked with a steady gait. Her hair, once always tied back, now fell loose and grey. Her hands trembled as she wrote orders, and for the first time she began to repeat instructions, something she had never done before. Margaret noticed the clear sign of wear and tear. "The lady needs to rest," he said, in a rare attempt at confrontation. Sarah raised her gaze, deep and distant. "If I stop, they won't stop." Time pressure was mounting. Sarah felt her life was drawing to a close. And if she died, who would continue the construction? Who would keep the spirits trapped in the labyrinth? Thus, he wrote a new guideline: "Teach others to keep going when I can't." But nobody wanted to inherit that mission. The house was growing. The secrets were piling up. The end was drawing near, and all the subplots slowly converged toward the same destination. The moment when Sarah would no longer be there to hold up the walls of reality. The winter of 1922 arrived silently in California. The mansion, now colossal, stretched like a wooden labyrinth across the hillside. Hundreds of rooms, impossible staircases, doors leading nowhere. Almost 40 years of uninterrupted construction, almost 40 years of vigil. But Sarah Winchester was tired. Margaret noticed it in the way her employer shuffled through the hallways. He no longer wrote long instructions. His notes were now short, trembling, as if each word required immense effort. And the 2 o'clock bell, it no longer rang with the same precision. Sometimes it was late, sometimes it didn't ring at all. On the evening of September 4th, Margaret carried the dinner tray to the door of the blue room. She knocked. No answer. She waited. Nothing. Worried, she opened the door. Sarah sat in the center chair of the room, surrounded by architectural plants scattered on the floor. Her eyes were open, but her breathing had stopped. The woman who kept the endless construction alive for nearly 4 decades had passed away. The silence that followed was unlike any other. It wasn't just the absence of human sound. It was as if the house itself had held its breath. Margaret closed the door slowly and stood there without crying, without speaking, without knowing what to do. The following morning, the news spread among the workers. Some made the sign of the cross. Others left their tools on the ground and went away without asking for pay. No one knew for sure who would take over, but everyone knew that something essential had ended. Sarah's body was buried in silence, without public speeches, without headlines. The outside world cared little. To them, only an eccentric widow had passed away. But inside the mansion, something began to change. On the first night without Sarah, the bell rang at 2 in the morning. It sounded louder, longer, and after it, footsteps echoed through empty corridors. Doors slammed. The wind swept through internal passages that should never have been opened to the outside. Margaret, alone in her room, heard the sound of dozens of voices whispering at the same time. The following morning, she gathered the few remaining workers. Construction must continue. This was her wish, he said, holding up one of Sarah's old notes. The men looked at each other. None of them truly believed it, but the fear of remaining in that unfinished house was greater than the fear of continuing to build. So they resumed work. But something was wrong. Newly built walls cracked on their own. Stairs installed in the morning disappeared by night. Doors appeared in places where no one had worked. The house now seemed to be changing itself. And then came the revelation. Margaret decided to enter the blue room, seeking answers. In the center of the room, she found a safe she had never noticed before. Inside it, a collection of letters written by Sarah over the years. The last one said, "If you are reading this, I have failed. I couldn't finish the house before they found the way out. The maze wasn't meant to trap them. It was meant to trap them away from the world. But they learned, they watch, they wait. When construction stops, they will be free." Margaret dropped the letter from her hands. Her heart was racing. She looked around. The wood creaked as if it were breathing. That night the bell did not ring. Instead, a single loud thud echoed throughout the mansion, and then another and another, like giant footsteps climbing invisible stairs. The workers fled. Margaret tried to hold her ground, but when she opened the main door, she found all the corridors altered. No path led to the exit. The house had locked itself. The following morning, villagers watched the mansion in silence. There was no more construction noise, no lights in the windows, no one entering or leaving. The endless work had stopped, and something that Sarah had kept contained for 40 years was now loose. The morning after the work stopped brought an unnatural silence to the hill. For the first time in 40 years, no hammer sounded, no cart arrived with wood, no worker crossed the gates. The mansion, which had always been a moving organism, now stood still, but not dead. There was something different in the air, as if the house itself were lurking. In the village, residents began to talk. Some said that the curse was finally over. Others, more superstitious, avoided looking directly at the hill. The priest suggested a mass in honor of the deceased Sarah. Few attended. Margaret, however, had not left the mansion. For days, no one saw her. Until one cloudy afternoon, she appeared at the main gate. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, her hands stained with dust. "The house won't let me leave," he told a neighbor before fainting. When he woke up in the local infirmary, he could only repeat one phrase: "They can walk wherever they want now." After her recovery, Margaret refused to return. She left San Jose without saying goodbye. She was never seen again. Without leadership and without workers, the mansion remained closed, but the strange events did not cease. They merely changed form. Nearby residents reported lights turning on by themselves at night, doors slamming shut on windless days, distant music, like an old music box playing by itself. Some swore they saw a woman in black in the second-story windows. Others said they heard the bell, though the physical object was never found after Sarah's death. The news quickly attracted the attention of curious onlookers. Young adventurers began to trespass on the property. Most returned within minutes, pale and silent. Some never spoke again about what they had seen. One of them left a phrase scribbled on a piece of paper found in his pocket: "She's still building." The city, pressured by the growing fame of the place, decided to intervene. A group of representatives entered the mansion to assess it. They stayed there for less than an hour. When they left, they announced that the place would be closed to the public due to structural issues. But the truth was different. They were lost. Corridors that led to the entrance now led to windowless rooms. Staircases ended in emptiness. Maps drawn minutes before no longer matched what they saw. The house was now changing without human hands. Over time, the mansion was officially abandoned. Nature reclaimed part of the gardens. The wood aged, but the main structure remained firm, as if something internal were supporting it. And on specific nights of the year, residents swore they would hear the sound of hammers again, rhythmic, precise, as if invisible workers were resuming the work. The consequences also affected the emotional world of those connected to the house. Elias Carter, already old, wrote in his diary shortly before he died, "We didn't build a house, we built a prison, and we forgot who was inside." Henry Collins, the journalist who had fled the mansion, was found years later in a nursing home. In his final days, he murmured about corridors, doors, and names on the walls. The city itself bore the burden. The name Winchester went from being a source of industrial pride to a whisper of warning. Parents forbade their children from playing near the hill. Couples avoided getting married in the nearby church. Shopkeepers closed early on moonless nights. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and extravagance, became a symbol of something deeper. Proof that human guilt can create monsters greater than any ghost. And while the world moved on, the house remained there, observing, waiting, breathing. For years, the mansion remained untouched, until in 1930, a young teacher named Evelyn Harper, she arrived in San Jose. She came from Chicago, fleeing a life that didn't belong to her. She was looking to start over, to find a place where no one knew her past. And he found a city that avoided talking about a house on top of a hill. Evelyn was curious by nature. Hearing whispers about the Winchester mansion, she noticed the fear in the residents' eyes. It wasn't just superstition, it was a collective memory of something that had actually happened. One afternoon, she decided to climb up to the rusty gate. She expected to find ruins, but she found a strangely preserved structure. The wood hadn't rotted as it should have, the windows were intact, and when she touched the front door, she felt a slight warmth, as if someone had just loosened the doorknob from the inside. In the following days, Evelyn researched old newspapers, accounts, forgotten letters. She discovered Sarah Winchester's story. She discovered the infinite construction. She discovered the final letter. When construction stops, they will be free. Evelyn didn't believe in ghosts, but she did believe in human trauma, in guilt, in obsession, and she believed that places hold echoes of the emotions of those who built them. She decided to go in. He took only a flashlight and a notebook. As he crossed the threshold, he realized the house wasn't abandoned. It was silently active. Fine dust on the floor, but no cobwebs. The air smelled of freshly cut wood. As he walked, he noted every detail. Stairs that ended at the ceiling, doors that opened onto walls, corridors that bent at impossible angles. But Evelyn didn't get lost. On the contrary, she felt that the house was watching her, evaluating her, but it didn't stop her from moving forward. In the blue room, she found the emotional center of the labyrinth. There were still papers on the floor, scribbled architectural plans, and in the center, the chair where Sarah had died. Evelyn felt that way, and he heard the bell. Not at 2 in the morning, but at that exact moment. A vibration ran through the floor. A cold breath brushed against his neck, and an image appeared in his mind, not as an external vision, but as a memory that wasn't his own. She saw Sarah, tired, surrounded by living corridors. She saw the names on the walls. She saw the guilt growing until it became architecture. And then he understood. The house was not a prison for outside spirits. It was a prison for Sarah's own guilt, a physical monument to the fear of facing one's pain. Evelyn opened her eyes. The bell stopped ringing. At that moment, he made a decision. Someone needed to bring the cycle to a close. Not with hammers, not with demolition, but with understanding. In the following months, Evelyn returned several times. She studied each floor plan. She mapped the corridors. She recorded everything in drawings. She published a small book called The House Where Guilt Turned to Wood. The book attracted national attention. Historians, architects, and curious onlookers flocked to the city. For the first time, the mansion began to be seen not as a curse, but as a human testament to extreme grief. The city, once fearful, began to accept the place. Gates were reopened. Guided tours began. Electricity was installed. The house ceased to be a secret and became public memory. And something changed. Reports of footsteps ceased. The bell was no longer heard. The nightlights disappeared. The house remained strange, but quiet. Evelyn wrote at the end of her book, "Pain doesn't need labyrinths. It needs a voice." She left San Jose years later, but she left behind something Sarah never had in life: understanding. The cycle of fear had been broken. The house remained, but the weight had been removed. For the first time in decades, the wind was blowing through the corridors without resistance. The following years transformed the Winchester mansion into a national attraction. What was once a feared whisper became a place visited by the curious, scholars, and tourists seeking mystery. Guides led groups through dead-end corridors. Children laughed at the doors that led to walls. Photographers documented every impossible staircase. But Evelyn Harper knew that something was still incomplete. Despite the apparent calm, there was a detail that no one mentioned. Certain areas of the house remained inaccessible. Doors that never opened. Passages that disappeared. A single room in the heart of the building that never appeared on official maps. Evelyn felt that this was where the story would truly end. One night, after the last group of tourists had left, she convinced the watchman to let her stay longer. She waited for the outside lights to go out and, with a flashlight, began a silent walk. The house looked different at night. Not threatening, just watchful. She followed an old corridor, then another, until she reached a narrow staircase that didn't appear in the records. She climbed slowly. At the top, she found a dark wooden door with no external handle, but when it touched the surface, the door opened by itself. The room was small and circular. In the center, a table. On it, the same Winchester rifle that Elias Carter had found decades before, and on the walls, the names, hundreds of them, hand-engraved. Evelyn approached. She ran her fingers over one of the names, and he heard the bell again. But now it didn't sound distant. It sounded inside his mind. Images emerged, soldiers, civilians, children, all falling before rifles. Not as supernatural ghosts, but as a collective memory of lives cut short. And then, a presence behind her. Not a frightening shadow, but the weary figure of Sarah Winchester, as Evelyn imagined her from old portraits. Sad eyes, no anger, no madness, just exhaustion. The figure did not speak, but Evelyn understood. Sarah hadn't built the house to trap spirits. He had built it so he would never have to face the true extent of the human suffering associated with the Winchester name. The labyrinth was an escape. Architecture was anesthesia. The endless construction was silence. And now, with the house open to the world, the last room, the only one truly closed off, needed to be acknowledged. Evelyn took a deep breath. She picked up the rifle from the table. Not to use it, but to carefully place it on the floor. Then she opened her notebook and wrote one last sentence. No wall can hide the truth, forever. When it ended, the bell stopped ringing. The air grew light. Sarah's figure vanished like dust in the wind. The following morning, Evelyn gathered the site administrators and showed them the secret room. The rifle was put on historical display. The names on the walls were preserved as a memorial. The mansion ceased to be merely a strange attraction. It became a place for reflection. Evelyn left again, leaving San Jose in peace with itself. He knew his work was done. The world now knew the whole story. Nothing was hidden anymore. Nothing else needed to be built. The climax was approaching, not in an explosion, but in total revelation. The house was ready for its final act. The day of the memorial's inauguration inside the Winchester mansion dawned shrouded in an unusual fog. It wasn't dense, but persistent, like a thin veil resting on the hill. Newspapers announced the event as a cultural milestone. The house would cease to be merely an architectural curiosity and would become a historical symbol. Evelyn Harper returned to the city just for that moment. She walked among the first visitors, keeping her distance, observing. People spoke quietly in front of the newly opened room, now protected by ropes and explanatory plaques. The rifle was inside a glass dome. The names, illuminated by soft lamps, seemed less threatening, almost human. But Evelyn sensed something was wrong. The house was too quiet. At 11 o'clock, when the official speech began in the front garden, a gust of wind swept through the interior corridors. Doors slammed shut on their own. Windows vibrated slightly. In the center of the memorial, the glass of the dome cracked. Nobody noticed immediately. Evelyn, however, felt the same shiver as the first time she had heard the bell. The sound didn't physically echo, but it pulsed inside her head. She ran inside. The corridors began to change, not violently, but subtly. Doors shifted, staircases lengthened. Visitors became confused, laughing nervously, thinking it was part of the attraction. In the central room, the glass dome shattered. The rifle fell to the ground, and the names on the walls began to darken as if fresh paint were emerging from within the wood. Evelyn entered the room, breathless. The temperature dropped. Then the house spoke, not with voice, but with movement. The walls vibrated, displaying scenes like living shadows, battles, executions, ambushes, domestic crimes, all linked by the same dry crackle the Winchester shot. Sarah's mistake became clear at that moment. She would believe that hiding the blame would make her disappear, but guilt, when ignored, takes root. The house was beginning to rebuild itself. Doors appeared. New corridors were formed. The cycle was trying to start again. Evelyn walked to the center of the room, ignoring the panicked tourists outside. She picked up the rifle. It weighed more than it should have, not as a weapon, but as an inheritance. Then something changed in her. It wasn't fear. It was complete understanding. She picked up the rifle and placed it back on the table, but this time under the names, and he spoke aloud, breaking decades of silence. You existed. You mattered. The blame will no longer be hidden. The bell rang. This time it's audible, a single, long, deep note that echoed throughout the entire mansion. The walls stopped moving, the names stopped fading, the air has stabilized, and then, slowly, the runners returned to their original positions. Visitors fell to their knees. Others wept without knowing why. In the center of the room, Sarah's image appeared once more, not as a haunting presence, but as a final memory. She observed Evelyn, not with fear, but with relief, and it disappeared. The glass dome was reassembled, intact. The rifle remained motionless. The house, for the first time since 1884, was truly silent. Evelyn left the room with tears in her eyes, but with a firm posture. She had done something Sarah had never been able to do. To face the truth without building a labyrinth around it. The conflict was over, not with destruction, but with acceptance. After the event in the central bedroom, the Winchester mansion was never the same again. In the following days, experts came to examine the structure, hoping to find rational explanations for what had occurred during the inauguration. They found nothing out of the ordinary. No architectural alterations, no structural flaws. Nothing to justify what dozens of people had witnessed, but no one else heard the bell. No one else has seen doors move on their own. No runner changed places again. The house remained strange, yes, but finally still. Like a mind that, after decades of turmoil, had found rest. The city of San Jose, once marked by silent apprehension, began to treat the mansion as a legitimate part of its history. Schools organized educational visits. Historians gave lectures on the industrial impact of Winchester weapons and the human toll that accompanied that legacy. The place ceased to be a sensationalist attraction and became a memorial. The room with the names became the most respected space for visitors. There were no photos there, no games, only silence and contemplation. Evelyn Harper never sought public recognition. After the event, she left town quietly. She returned to Chicago and continued her life as a teacher. Few knew that this ordinary woman had been the final piece of a story that began half a century earlier. In her last personal writings, she recorded only one sentence about the mansion. The house stopped growing when someone finally listened to what she was trying to say. Regarding the figure of Sarah Winchester, her name was rescued from the caricature of the Mad Widow. New studies revealed her intelligence, her profound grief, and her human inability to cope with irreparable losses. The world began to see her not as a supernatural legend, but as an extreme portrait of human grief. The house remained as physical proof of this, not as a prison for spirits, not as a monument of terror, but like an architectural scar of unaddressed guilt. And as a reminder that running away from pain only makes it worse. In the years that followed, visitors swore they felt a gentle peace as they walked through the winding corridors. No more fear, just respect, as if the house had finally completed its mission. The cycle was complete. The endless construction had ended, not by hammers, but through understanding. On a quiet autumn afternoon, a child walked through the corridors of the Winchester mansion, holding her mother's hand. As she passed the room with the names, she paused for a moment, observing the illuminated walls. "Mom, who wrote all this?" he asked. The mother smiled gently. "People who needed to be remembered." The child thought for a moment and replied, "So the house is like a book?" The mother nodded. "A book made of wood and memory." As they left, the wind swept through an ancient corridor. No doors moved, no bells rang. The house remained silent, but for a brief moment he seemed to smile. Stories like that of the Winchester mansion remind us that not all labyrinths are made of walls. Some are built within ourselves. Running from pain, hiding guilt, or silencing the past only strengthens what we try to avoid. If this story touched you in any way, please share your thoughts. What feelings or memories do you believe people try to hide in their own labyrinths? Leave a comment, tell us where you're following this story from, and join the conversation. And if you want more intense, exciting, and mysterious narratives like this one, subscribe and follow the upcoming stories. In the end, every house holds a story. Some are simply waiting for someone willing to listen to them.